Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Bethanne. Happy New Year if you haven't seen my first video of 2021, which I posted on the 1st. And in my video today, what I wanted to talk about is the first book that I've read in 2021, which is Paying the Land by Joe Sacco. I first heard about this book on Jen's channel over at Remembered Reads, so I will provide a link to that in the description box below, so please go check that out. I get tons of nonfiction recommendations from her channel. They've all been fantastic so far. So this book is comics journalism. So you can see I'll just open to a random page. The entire book is comics, but it's entirely nonfiction. It's journalistic. So Joe Sacco, for this book, traveled to the Northwest Territories. I think he did 2 research trips and conducted lengthy interviews, illustrated, these are actual, drawings of the people that he interviewed in the book. And the people that he was focused on are the Dene Nation in the Northwest Territories of Canada. And he worked with members of many different bands of the Dene throughout the Northwest Territories. And in this book, he's I think essentially trying to lay out, or at least what I got out of it was kind of some sort of summary of the current multifaceted issues that are facing the Dene people in the 21st century. And so a lot of it focuses on struggles for land rights, including legal struggles with local territorial governments, and then also with the Canadian national government over who has the right to the land, and in particular who has the right to the resources on the land and under the land, including natural gas. And then a lot of it is about the cultural struggle, which includes kind of the transition from a subsistence-based traditional lifestyle and culture to a wage-based economy with the influx of Eurocentrism and white Canadians, and what that has meant for the Dene as a people. And then a big part of that is the experiences of the Dene with the residential school system of Canada, where the youth were under threat to their parents and also often forcibly removed from their parents and sent to schools often run by various churches, where they were kind of forcibly assimilated into white cultures. And so kind of the intergenerational trauma of literally the trauma perpetrated on the bodies of those youth, but also the trauma of losing your language, being punished for speaking your language, and the trauma of losing your culture through that route of generations that had it wiped out of them forcibly. So this book was incredibly powerful and doesn't have any answers. It's not supposed to. Nobody has any answers to what's going on with Indigenous peoples throughout North America, and it's one of the biggest problems we're going to face in the 21st century as we, as white capitalists, want to access and extract more and more resources that are in hard to get places, and as a culture, as we're now being asked to grapple with the darker periods of our recent history of the past 400 to 600 years. So I thought this was really compelling. And even though it's based in Canada and I'm American, I still feel like I got a lot out of it because the culture is unique, but a lot of the same patterns played out in the lower 48 of the U.S., thinking especially in Minnesota, where I live currently. So anyway, so I just wanted to share, I guess, a couple things. So, kind of one point that a lot of the folks that Joe Sacco interviews for this book, one point that they make is that from an environmental standpoint, you can be against fracking and resource extraction, but there's always another side. And so, from one perspective, in these really remote areas, those are the only jobs available. And so what are people going to do if there's no resource extraction jobs? And then also, white environmentalists come in and say, well, no fracking, but they're using their iPhones, they're using gas to get to these remote areas. And so kind of shedding light on it's not as clear cut as people wish it would be. So I really appreciated the treatment of the environmental and resource conversations in this book. Of course, for me, the part that was hardest to read was the part about the residential schools. I'm reading it as a parent and reading it as somebody whose not in the Canadian context, but in the US context, descended from people who helped perpetrate that against American indigenous populations. Because parts of my family, some of my ancestors have been in the US for a long time. And so, in some of the people that he interviewed talk about kind of the horrors of the residential school system, but on the other hand, they can recognize some things of value that they got out of it. And, one part I thought was compelling was they can talk about a few things of value, but then they say, you can't talk about balancing the good and the bad because there's no comparison between the good things and the bad things. They're just on totally separate scales. And people refer to the bad things that came out of the residential school system as cultural genocide, let alone sexual and physical abuse that happened to children in those schools. So I thought that was compelling. There's a couple figures in here. So, for example, 150,000 Indigenous children entered Canada's residential schools. More than 6,000, or 4%, died from disease, neglect, abuse, or other injuries while in the system's care, which, of course, is just a tiny fraction of the children who graduated from those schools and have faced lifelong challenges because of their experiences. But just thinking about that, 6,000 children, 4%, 0.1% would be too many. So there's some startling facts like that in here. Another interesting point was that, as I mentioned, the residential schools, a lot of them were run by churches. And one of actually a couple of the interviewees in this book, even though they suffered so many abuses in these religious settings and by some individuals who nuns and priests, they first of all make the argument of, but not all nuns and priests are bad, and can point to very specific examples of religious figures that have played huge positive roles in their communities. But then also, there's one woman who was, had turned to alcohol abuse as a way to self-medicate and deal with the trauma of her childhood in the residential school system, and then as a way to recover from alcohol abuse, turned to the religion that had been forced on her in the residential school system, and found healing there. So just the complexity of all these cultural issues, I just find so interesting and compelling, and really kind of an emotional read. And then there are moments of levity. There's like one. So of course this journalist, Joe Sacco, is from Portland and is spending lots of time up in the Northwest Territories. And so at one point he starts joking about we're almost done with this book and I have yet to encounter any wildlife. I saw one owl. And so he's very excited when he gets to go check a fishing net with one of the folks that he's interviewing. And so it's like, Joe of the North leaps into action. He takes a trout from Trout Lake. He has engaged with the fauna and redeemed himself in the eyes of his readers. And then later in this little story, he's trying to take pictures of this, traditional way of netting the fish. And the guy he's interviewing and helping for the day says, like, do you want to take pictures, or are you actually going to help? Like, come on, dude. So there's like a little bit of levity. And then the book ends with kind of circling back to the tough economic questions about, is there any way to balance the traditional culture and keeping that alive and respecting that with kind of the perhaps irreversible need for a wage economy, even in these very remote areas. And so there's leaders, local community leaders on every possible side of that issue. And just one thing that stood out to me as part of just the difficulty of it is they were talking about several of the legal land claim struggles with different bands of the Dene people trying to get kind of the legal rights to their land. And in one case, it's there's 4 different jurisdictions that have to be dealt with. So land straddles the British Columbia, the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and then the Canadian federal government needs to be involved as well. And so when you're talking about negotiations on that scale, it's like very, very difficult for anything to happen when that many parties are at the table. Um, so anyway, so I thought this was just, at least from my perspective as someone who didn't know very much, this seemed like a really respectful kind of treatment of a lot of very modern, very real issues for the Dene people in the Northwest Territories. It's so much just representing the interviewees. Like I mentioned, Joe Sacco literally illustrated their faces, and most of the text in the comic bubbles is direct quotations from those people. So there's really very little of kind of a narrative voice, like pushing an agenda or anything like that. It feels very much like a representation of the people that he interviewed, at least from a reader's perspective. So anyway, I really enjoyed this. This was a really excellent thing to choose after braiding sweetgrass, which I read in December as a way to kind of continue my learning on these issues. So highly recommend. It's a bit of a tough read, but this was absolutely fantastic, and I'm actually going to go look for Joe Sacco's other work, this comics journalism format I hadn't been exposed to yet, and I really enjoyed it and found it compelling. So I've talked long enough. With that, I will wrap up and just say Happy New Year again, and thank you for watching. If you've watched this whole video, if you like what I'm doing, please hit the subscribe button and stick around. I'd love to see you in the next video. Thanks. Bye.